Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Hello. Good evening.
Just your last 8 shots.
That'll do it. That'll do it.
She's coming.
Okay.
Take it all the way open. More handouts.
Thank you.
All right. Get it out. What'd you get? I did. Are we streaming yet?
We're on.
We're on.
You're on.
All right, Carolyn.
It's Shoe Demon. Okay, we got an exercise.
Okay, that was you. All right. It's too close to this.
But are there any suggestions of how we can make topic of fiction fun? Looking for this to be a fun session. I'm struggling with how to make topic of fiction fun.
Is it supposed to be fun?
Well, we're trying to change things up and try to come up with some new ways of presenting it. I thought that I thought of the old with Hogan's Heroes. Is anybody remember that show?
I do.
Is it Hogan's Heroes? Anybody remember that show? What was the Sergeant Schultz? Is that who it was? Now, see, if Sergeant Schultz was in charge of Garrison, crucified Jesus, what would have happened? They would probably crucified Pontius Pilate by mistake.
I see nothing. I see nothing.
Anyway, it was.
I remember my mom I remember watching that show and my mom saying over and over again, "It wasn't that way. Don't think it was that way." In those prison camps, that's not the way it was. I remember that the Pope, after Mel Gibson came out with the Passion of the Christ, and it was so graphic, and they asked the Pope about it, and he said, "It is what it is." That was his response.
That was the Pope's response.
To the suffering and the pain that was involved.
Because I remember when they interviewed Mel Gibson, a lot of it, I think he held back. Well, it could have been a lot more graphic. Because the flogging, they used to call that what? Half death? A lot of the people didn't make the flogging. Anyway, no one's going to help me out. But we're going to find some way this topic not quite as. Huh? Yeah, well, and that's exactly right. That's why I'm trying to come up with this, because it's a different take on crucifixion, and I had not realized that material came up. So this is different.
I think if you focus on
The love
that Jesus had, and
Or looking at it from, as Jim and I were talking earlier, the Easter side of the cross.
Yeah.
Is that the cross is a great source of victory and triumph.
Well, in the Garden of Gethsemane, I think, maybe it's some scholars who say this, they tried to say, was there another way? Is the cross the only, instead of Jesus say, remove this cup from me, something like that. Now, what do you think the cup was the cup of the suffering on the cross, or the suffering? Because we don't have that. Think
I think it was cup drinking sin.
Yes.
Sin, cup of wrath.
And
Separation.
in the Garden of Gethsemane. And and again, it's like alone.
Y'all were in kind of I call it the holding cell for
Yes. Yes. I remember standing at the top and saying there was no ladder. They just pushed you in. Sherry Unthank won't be here. She got her second shot today. She said she's really sick.
Carol be here? Carol's not. Okay. So we're on our own.
Just being in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Some of those olive trees are as old as 2,000 years old. Is that right?
Yes.
So are we about ready to start again another minute? I don't know. Maybe Phyllis is still down there, so sure. Has you have any special instructions for tonight on?
No.
No. Any questions from last night? Questions from last night? Questions? Are we going to hear
You said,
Is this another?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
said it kind
Yeah, okay, yes. This denied crucifixion, he's not as animated as he was in the first few days. So he's not quite as animated. But, no. And it's full of information. It's just a different take on the crucifixion. I'm hoping that's set up. We'll watch the video.
Carolyn did call me last night and just wanted you all to be aware that if someone had the gift of hospitality, she said Jim is going to need some place to stay when she gets home. So she also sent a very extensive list of Jim's sins, and so I made that into a handout. It's downstairs. You pick it up when you leave tonight. So it's that real big thick one. Yeah, it's quite a few pages.
Leftover pronounced.
Yeah. No, here I got some. Yeah, here's
This extra
this.
fertilizer.
Yeah, I've got some. Oh, okay. And I've got some others for the prior nights. Glad to have you. Glad to be here.
No, that is required.
Well, I guess let's go ahead and get started with the Heavenly Father, we thank you for staying. We thank you again for the opportunity to come and study the Word. We ask that your thoughts, your words present in our classroom help us to understand this material tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. We've got a lot of material stuff, but I do want to talk about some unfinished business from last night. Okay. Last night we talked about what? The Catholics, right? Jesus spoke a lot of parables. We're all familiar with the parables. There are some scholars, and I'll give you the hints of and you see if you can come up with the parable. So Jesus is said to have spoken a parable while looking across Capernaum to the Decapolis. See if you can guess which parable. Now, I spent a lot of time trying to validate that point, whether when he spoke this parable and was he standing, looking across the Sea of Galilee. But anyway, some scholars say it was. Yet, this parable contains riotous living. Anybody have the answer already?
Prodigal son.
Oh,
Prodigal son.
yeah. The prodigal son. When you think about it, was Jesus looking at the Decapolis from Capernaum when he spoke that parable? Because I think what we often think when we think of the prodigal son is we think, well, the prodigal son must have been way, way far away, and coming back. But when you look at the maps and the distance and walking and so forth, it is surely possible, and a lot of scholars say that this is what Jesus had in mind. Had in mind someone was at the Decapolis. Okay. Any questions on that?
No, just your clues were too good.
I sure do. Sorry.
We should also point out that the herd of pigs, I believe, were Arkansas Razorbacks. I think that's the group that.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I should have let that one alone. My bad.
Tonight we're going to study the crucifixion. Now, what as a class do we know about the crucifixion? We should have about 40 or 50 things that we can enumerate. Know about the crucifixion. All right, now I'll get it. So, but tell me anything that you know about the crucifixion. It's all right, I'll pick one.
Mary was at the cross.
Mary? Who? Which Mary?
Oh, his mother.
Okay. and Mary Magdalene was at the cross, and other
All the
Marys.
Marys.
In other words, one of the things we're going to talk about is the significance of the women at the cross. Why was that important? Why was it important that women be at the cross? Right? Yeah, and once again, the women do all the work, right? So they were, but there were other reasons. They could serve as witnesses, even though legally they couldn't serve as witnesses in court. They could serve as witnesses because who else would be the guys all fled, right?
Except John.
Except John.
Except John.
What else we know? The women at the cross. What else? Anything else we know about the crucifixion?
What was it? Just a Roman execution? Or did other cultures?
I actually think that it did evolve from other cultures. Primarily, our focus is on Roman, and we think of crucifixion like small numbers. I mean, there were times there were large numbers of people crucified. But
Sanhedrin and all could not put Jesus to death.
the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling body, did not have authority to put Jesus to death. Or
Jesus said, "Forgive them, Lord."
said that on the cross. So one of the final 7 sayings on the cross. One of the final 7 sayings.
Crucifixion was the
Pardon?
There were 2 other guys.
There are 2 other guys there, and that's significant to us. Yes, that's right.
crucifixion was the worst form of execution at the time. It was death by suffocation. It also invoked tremendous amounts of shame because the person was completely without clothing, and it was not just the physical torture, but also the insults that were hurled at people who were crucified. So it had a tremendous amount of shame associated.
Yes, sir.
Jesus died quickly, so a lot of times people linger on.
Right.
Part of the story.
Yeah, they were even surprised he had already died. And why was that probably the case? Because he had suffered the flogging. So that's probably the case. And
And also, I think because he gave himself.
yes.
It became dark.
Yep, it came dark over, and it says over all the land. That gets we have to talk about that. Huh? No, okay.
The other thing was also crucifixions were done in places that are conspicuous so that everyone is passing by will see.
In other words, the place of the crucifixion, Golgotha, was not a haphazard selection by the Romans. And we'll get to the handout, was not a haphazard selection or from the perspective of Christianity, too. Okay. I don't have a picture on it, but it is interesting because y'all have all been to the Mount of Olives. Have you been to the place on the Mount of Olives where the crucifixion place?
On the Mount of Olives?
We went to the place that is said to be the crucifixion site.
You went to one of the crucifixion sites which had the rock quarry and had something that looked like a skull. You went to that one?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and then there's the garden tomb.
Yeah.
And at one end of the garden is this.
We actually.
Oh, is this a joke?
Yeah.
There's a local joke here.
We actually had a Holy Week Bible study on nothing but Golgotha, where it is, it doesn't really matter. We actually had that. And we won't go there tonight, but it is important. It ties in the ashes of the red heifer, ties in a number of other things. But we won't. What else do you know about the crucifixion? No, they're good.
And mirror the sacrifices of Jesus.
Okay, and mirrored it in what way? What way?
a substitute for us.
Substitute, but what about the timing?
Was it Passover?
Yeah, in other words, they slaughtered the lambs at 3:00, right? And Jesus died at 3:00. Is that right? Okay. What else do we know?
They took it, cut it aside.
Pardon?
He was cutting it aside.
Pierced in the side. And Roy, I remember you talking about that one time. Medical term, we're not going to use the medical term of why, but it came out. It says it pierced the side of the
Blood mixed
blood mixed with water. And Roy, consume it.
already covered.
There you go. Okay. Anything else?
And that, I'm sorry.
The veil was torn.
The veil was torn from top to bottom. Ugh. That's interesting. Pastor Jeff.
I was going to say that is the cross point, if we want to use that expression, between the Old and the New Testament.
Hey, yes. Between the Old and the New Testament. I wish I had the picture on it because it talks about when the curtain was torn and the significance of just like you're talking about. Pastor Jeff, you had anything?
I was just going to say that the water and the blood. The year we did the study on the water, in Holy Week, it was we learned that the altar where the lambs were sacrificed, that that there were tubes that ran down under the altar through the rock and out to a riverbed, and they would have to use gallons and gallons and gallons of water to flush all of the blood off of the altar area and away from that area. And again, Jesus, the connection between the Passover lamb and Jesus.
Anything else? Else?
Jesus had help carrying cross.
Simon?
Sorry.
So we talked about, we studied the book of Acts, that he had become lack of a better word.
Well, his sons were there.
So, sons of Simon.
This is a question. Were all the disciples there?
The disciples, well, they'll say John was there.
That's the only one.
Yeah, everybody else kind of took off. Yeah. So that's why it's so important that the women be there. You know, the women. Anything else? Oh, I'll ask this because we had a whole week Bible study. We spent 4 nights on this. Is there any physical evidence that remains of the crucifixion other than nails and the cross of Cathedral of Notre Dame?
Shroud of Turin.
Shroud of Turin. We had a 4-week study, 4-day study of the Shroud of Turin. Anybody have any questions about it? Because we could spend all night on just that. Anybody have any questions about the Shroud of Turin? Anybody have any? Everybody know what we're talking about? Anybody know what we're talking about? Kind of know what we're talking about.
And it was the
Burial cloth. Okay. And it's kind of, I'll just give you one tidbit. In the Bible, it says when they go into the tomb that the napkin that was around his face was left in the tomb. Does anybody remember that part of it? Okay. That's called the Siderium. The face cloth is called the Siderium. That's in Spain. Okay. The Shroud of Turin itself is in Turin, Italy. So, has anybody seen it? Because it only comes out, 10 years? Did y'all ever see it? Okay. Now you have the Siderium that is in Spain. You have the Shroud of Turin that's in Turin, Italy. Wouldn't it be nice to examine both pieces of cloth? And if they did, what would we like to find? They did, yeah. Well, You're right. There's no limit. But part of what they found was the congruency of the bloodstains. So the two pieces of cloth at one time or another were together. I thought that was interesting. Okay.
One you mentioned about locations.
Yes.
They tell you when you go on a tour in Israel that great deal of research went in identifying the various spots where usually there's a church that's built to commemorate something that happened in the life of Christ. But you can make arguments for other locations. There is only one place in all of Israel where they are 100% certain that the place designated was the place the event took place, and that is the Praetorium where Jesus was tortured,
Where they threw the dice.
where they played Basileia.
What else do we know? Anything else? Why are we? Terry's on a roll here. He just.
Jesus said to your mother, to your son, mother protection, a place to be.
Right. Yeah, that one of the last 7 sayings on the cross. Okay. Well, so there's really not. I mean, we've covered pretty much everything. Probably just go home. There's probably not much left to cover, is there? All the writing on the cross. And what did it say? It said, Jesus of Nazareth, choose. Anything interesting there? You already know. You know what's interesting about it, don't you? Do we have one up here? Does it say it? Oh, you know what? Okay, you can't quite make it out. Okay. Y'all know, you know what you are headed on this?
I'm not sure, but I know that some Jews did not want.
Well, they didn't like it, did they?
And when they went to another king, he said, "Have you not agree?"
Yeah, they didn't like it. Why didn't they like it? When they went to Pilate, saying, "No, you can't say that. You can't say that. You got to take that down." You know, why did they like it?
Because they don't want to get accused.
Well, there's actually something that's a good answer. Good answer. But if you take the letters in Hebrew, it spells out. You take the first letter of each of those, it spells out God.
It does.
Yeah.
Yes, it
if you
does.
take the first letters and you have to go with right to left. Okay. But if you take each letter, it spells out God. So obviously, and we have it up here. It's a little different. But, a lot of times the crosses will just have the letters. It won't say Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews.
And green letters. And with the right to left, we read from left to right. With the right to left, it's always read from right to left, and it was God.
Yeah.
But it was not spelled God. Spelled.
Yeah, they didn't spell it out.
I know. I forgot. Okay. I forgot all the details. But that's one of the reasons why they were adamant. They wanted that taken down.
Right.
They didn't want that. Okay, anything else?
Who put that on?
I assume that's a
Roman
real good
soldiers.
question. I assume the Roman soldiers, but I may Roman soldiers. Roman soldiers. And maybe even the centurion will.
But the Roman soldier, the centurion guardsman likes to sack the Roman soldier, but
No, Roman soldiers. Yes.
They break their legs
Yeah, and why would they do that?
so that they
They were still alive.
push up.
Yeah, they couldn't push up to get air, so they break their legs so that the asphyxiation would take. And they didn't break Jesus' legs because he was already deceased.
And they said one of the prophets said his legs
Would not, right?
Bones.
Bones would not be broken. Gosh.
I'm looking for physical stuff about this picture or whatever.
Well, I'm going to let Pastor Jeff in his sermon talk about what all represents, but not tonight.
I just wanted for a period of time to separate.
Yeah, and that was yes. And that's a lot of scholars have written volumes. Okay, well, we'll continue. So this is just Sharon, help me out here because I want to make sure we got about 20 minutes of video. So there's, pardon? I just don't want to go over. Cut me off at about in 10 minutes. Okay. I can see the clock, but I know what happened. Okay. Lesson 3. Again, Ray Vanderlei focuses on the Gospel of Mark. And I'm trying to picture myself, if I'm Mark and I've got this blank piece of paper in front of me and I'm writing to these Christians in Rome, what can I say to convince them that Jesus was the Son of God? How can I do that?
He rose from the dead.
Well, yeah, but see, the problem is that other so-called deities in the pagan world, they would say they rose from the dead. Okay, this was not a Greek methodology.
He took on earth.
Yes, that would be, and he does. Mark does include a lot of the miracles. Terry?
And go back to prophecies.
Yeah.
This happened.
So including the prophecies. Now Matthew speaking to the Jews is generally is credited with writing more about the prophecies than Mark. Mark is speaking. I don't know, in Pastor Jeff, anybody know that the Christians that were in Rome at that time were a lot of them Gentiles? Anybody know? I don't know. I don't know. But you're right, Terry, including the prophecies.
It appears majority were Gentiles, but significant from Jews.
At Rome at that time, a majority will say we're Gentiles. Okay, so he's writing to these Gentiles, but he's got to write something that they would understand, something that's going on that they can identify with. So the readers of the first century would immediately saw that the template that Mark was using to indicate that Jesus was Lord. We don't get it because we don't see it when we read Mark. He's using kind of a template. Everybody knows what template is. Using a template, and so that they would immediately say, "Oh yes, this is what's going on." Why was Jesus executed with two people? Ray Vanderlei does a pretty good job, I think, of talking about that. What was the significant? And I want to make sure I'm saying this right. The translation that we're looking for, because we'll talk about it in the handout, is the place of the skull. Not the place of a skull, the place of the skull. Okay?
I never looked at it.
I'm assuming I got that translation right.
You got it.
I got it right? The place of the skull.
Place of the skull.
Place of the skull. Now the question that we have is, whose skull?
That's every time I read.
Yeah. How many have even heard of that before tonight? Anybody? Had few people. Yeah, few people heard of that.
Didn't we talk about that one?
I probably did. but that's the handout. I think is interesting. Now I'm not going to get up here and tell you that 100% that is exactly what happened. That Adam's skull was there. What I am going to tell you is that the legend, the tradition, and when he's writing the place of the skull, all the people would have known what he was talking about. He would be talking about Adam's skull. They would have known the place, not necessarily that the skull was still there or anything like that, but they would have known the place.
But there's also painting, and I can't tell you the artist or where the painting is, but of the cross, and skull under.
I actually went last night to try to show you the painting and technological inefficiencies got it. But yes, there's a famous painting, and what's interesting, and I think there's more than one. But what is interesting about the one I was looking at is how old of a painting. How old of a painting? This was a painting, that goes way back. So, but yes, there are paintings, and some people even have crucifixes that have skull. They'll have a crucifix. Right. This one doesn't.
I mean, the crucifix It's not a cross.
Has to be a crucifix.
Crucifix.
Yeah, not a cross. Okay, that's right. Okay. The significance of the women, talk about that, is likely written to Jewish Christians. It was probably written before the destruction of the temple, 70 AD. We're talking about the Gospel of Mark. The word gospel is generally said to be good news, but in Rome during the first century, it meant an imperial announcement was being. Okay. The emperors at that time, Julius Caesar, at 100 BC, died at 44. He died at 44 BC. Well, I guess it could be. That's 60 years old. I guess it could be. Augustus Caesar, and the emperor at the time that Jesus was crucified was Tiberius. Okay. Mark was writing to Christians. His audience could not miss the point, for example, of the soldiers enrobing and crowning Jesus. They would have immediately recognized what was going on. The Roman soldiers would do the same to Caesar after a victory. Notice how specific Mark is in his details years after Jesus' death. The details include gathering the old guard, resurrection, the requisition of a bystander to carry the cross, the translation of the name Golgotha, the offer of refusal of a drink, specification of time of the crucifixion, and the numbering and placement of others in respect. He's got all of those details in there, and we're going to see that in why these first century Christians in Rome would have identified. Okay. About 20 BC forward, the triumph procession was reserved for the all-powerful Caesar. In other words, if Caesar had a victory over somebody, they would have, just like we do nowadays, in the Super Bowl, you have a parade and that sort of thing. So if they had a victory, then they would have a triumphal procession. The Praetorian Guard made or broke the power of the emperors. There's nothing new to that. Of course, if you're a politician or if you're a person in power, you need to have the military behind you. And I wish I knew about the riots where the military took over recently. What is it? Yeah, I have not studied it. Okay. The wearing of purple was outlawed from anyone below the equestrian rank. And this scholar here seems to think, I don't know, I thought about this one. He says the only available robe would likely have been the robe of Pilate. That's too much of a stretch. Okay. When the Roman procession began, the Caesar would meet the soldiers to distribute gifts to them. I take care of the soldiers. Jesus is led out to the streets of Jerusalem and placed in crucifixion outside of the city. It was often a place which would serve as a public place to people that the Romans were in control. Okay, we've got just a couple minutes. We got 1 minute. 1 minute? We've already 1 minute. Okay, we got 1 minute. If you haven't read before or heard before about Adam's skull, I've given you the handout. It's interesting reading. I'm not going to tell you, if this is exactly the case, but it's surely interesting reading. And let's say it's legend. But what we can say, I think, with certainty is that the people reading that would have known the place. They would have known the place that everybody identified that this is the place of the skull. Okay. Let's see. We'll just tell you what, we're going to go ahead and start the video.
The Colosseum, the largest amphitheater ever built in the Roman world, still draws crowds. Built by the emperors Vespasian and Titus in the 70s and early 80s AD. Built, and this is a bit less known, built by the spoils of war over the defeat of the Jews, the destruction of the temple. In that Roman world, when the Romans defeated another people, it was assumed that that meant that the Roman gods were superior to the gods of the defeated people. Hence, the gods of Rome are greater than the God of the Jews. And I think that's exactly what this said. So imagine those early followers of Jesus who came to Rome and had to explain that their Messiah, Savior and King, had been arrested, sentenced, and executed by an agent of Caesar. How would you explain that? Let me show you something about one of those early believers and how he framed the crucifixion of Jesus in a way that declared Jesus Christ is Lord and King. Come, let's go see. In the days of Caesar Augustus, Jesus was born. One of the Gospels starts that way. Paul says, I appeal to Caesar. I think most of us read right past that character as if somehow that's only a date. I don't think so. I think Caesar is a character on the stage in the biblical story of Jesus, his disciples, and Paul. And we've come in a way to the roots of that Caesar part of the story. We're standing at the edge of the Forum of Augustus. A little bit of its glory is still here. You can see the marble on the floor, the pattern. You can see a few columns standing here. I can see the outline of the hip of the roof up above. The broad staircase in front of the temple that was here, the two apses on either end. A forum that ran more than 100 meters in that direction, mostly unexcavated, right here under the city of Rome, the modern city of Rome. In the 1st century BC, there was a struggle between those who wanted Rome to remain a republic and those who wanted it to become an imperial power under an emperor. Julius Caesar wanted to be that first emperor and used his military power to bring it about. For that, he was assassinated by the party who wanted to remain a republic, led by Cassius and Brutus. His adopted son, Octavian, raised an army, along with an ally, Mark Antony, and they met at that beautiful plain there at the foot of the Acropolis of Philippi. And Antony and Octavian were victorious. Cassius and Brutus committed suicide. In gratitude for his victory, Octavian, who would become Caesar Augustus, vowed to build a temple to honor Mars. Mars Ultor, he said. Mars the Revenger. We have vengeance for my father's assassination. Octavian, now Caesar Augustus, would also be responsible for the deification process of his father. A comet appeared during Julius's memorial that was interpreted to mean Julius ascended to heaven, seated with the gods, making Octavian God on earth. Slowly from Octavian on, the people and even the emperors themselves thought of the emperor as the Son of God. They advertised it in 100 ways: coins, statues, sculpture of every kind, and a procession called a triumph. And in ancient history, it was first for triumphant generals who would parade on the Via Sacra, the sacred way in Rome, leading prisoners, soldiers carrying plunder from the war. Remember that menorah and those trumpets and the table of showbread on Titus's arch, up to Capitoline Head Hill, to the Temple of Jupiter. Sometimes some of the plunder was left here to be displayed in Mars Ultor Temple. Triumph, they called it. From 20 BC on, that practice of triumph was officially limited to the emperors. And slowly but surely, it was a way of displaying not only their sovereignty, but their deity. Twice, Paul uses such a triumphal procession as an illustration, a metaphor of Jesus and his followers. But I think there's an even more subtle use of that idea in the Bible, in one of those books as well. Kind of hard to show you here, and it's nearly impossible to get in these ruins, especially these which are being restored right now. But if you remember when we studied Moses, we went to a replica of the tabernacle that helped us to understand what that tabernacle was and how it was used. I'd like to do something similar here, because I think I can better illustrate how the Bible uses the idea of triumph to declare to the world who Jesus is. Come with me. Come. Remember, Paul mentions it twice, in 2 Corinthians and in Colossians. I came across a study recently of a couple of outstanding New Testament scholars who suggest that Mark may have been using very subtly ideas in describing Jesus and what happened to him that would have been metaphors of a Roman triumph. Now realize Mark is an inspired gospel, so whatever's in Mark is what God led him to write. But by tradition, and I think with some much support, Mark was written to Roman Christians, people who had experienced triumph, probably when the book arrived, because Nero had not been in power all that long. He starts saying Jesus is the Son of God, so clearly he puts him on a throne in contrast to Caesar of that day, who claimed to be God on earth. What would they have understood a Roman triumph to be? The history of a triumph goes way back to the Greeks. They had a god named Dionysus, who was the dying, rising god. And annually, on his festival, the king of the local city, the city-state, would put on the robe that normally hung on the statue of Dionysus and would lead a procession through the city streets as the people lined the street chanting Triumphe, or in Greek, Triambos. Show yourself to us. Reveal yourself to us. And the idea was Dionysus, who had died, now is coming back and represented in the person of the king. And they may have actually thought that in some unique way those ancient kings took on the character of Dionysus. The Greeks then moved that idea from Dionysus to Zeus, probably because he's king of the gods. The Romans would pick up the practice. Early on, they used it for conquering generals. And they would start in the Praetorium and process through the city, leading a procession with slaves from the captured places with the plunder of the war, and the people would stand chanting Triumphe, triumph, 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 to celebrate the greatness of the general. But somewhere during Caesar Augustus's reign, that practice became limited to emperors. So triumphs in Jesus' day and Paul's day were imperial. It was the emperor's triumph to declare both his sovereignty as Lord of the Roman Empire, but also to affirm, to encourage an awareness of his deity, which was increasingly important in that Roman world. So if you were a first century Roman and had seen Nero's triumph, or some other emperor, what would it be like? Well, let's unpack that. It started at the Praetorium, the place the Praetorian Guard was stationed. And the Praetorians would turn out. You can picture them with their breastplates shining and polished, their helmets polished, the red crests, as they stood in formation as that emperor, Lord, and God to be entered. Because if the Praetorians don't support you, you're not going to be emperor. So it started with them. They would, or someone would, in their presence, give the emperor to be a purple robe. On occasion, it was off of the statue of a god. They often dressed their gods. Purple was the royal color in that particular culture. So you took that royal robe off of Zeus, for example, and you put that on the emperor to be. Even if you weren't calling him Lord and God, there's no doubt there was a unique connection between the gods and the emperor. And then that wreath, again, often hinting at his deity. And there he stood, and then the Praetorians would receive gifts from him. It didn't come cheap to get their support necessarily, and I'm sure they acclaimed him. There's no record of a formula, but if you look at how Caesar was acclaimed in other settings, think gladiators. Hail Caesar! Hail Caesar! Hail Caesar! You can see him standing there chanting, or Imperator! Imperator, dominator, emperor, as they stood and acclaimed the Lord and God. Then a procession started at the Praetorian on the Via Sacra. Imagine, we walked a bit on a few of those stones, even in the ruins. And that Via Sacra wound its way through the city, lined with people, getting a glimpse of this Lord and God. Every few yards along the way, an altar with incense burning, so the whole city smelled of incense. The amount Nero used, astronomical. I've seen numbers in the millions of dollars worth of incense that Nero had. And that parade would make its way, and then through the Forum where we were at Mars Ultor, and then up to Capitoline Hill. As the procession went, there would be a sacrificial bull. Some of the sculptures show a bull being led by a rope, a sacrifice to be made when we get to the temple. And someone standing next to the bull with that axe, the instrument of death that would be used to offer to kill that sacrificial animal. And then the procession reached Head Hill, or Capitoline Hill, and the Temple of Jupiter. Called that, by the way, because there was a myth in Dionysius of Halicarnassus records it, that when the excavations were made to build the city, on that hill was found an intact human head. Eyes, hair, skin, and so they named it, he says, Capit, head Hill. When they arrived there, the emperor was offered a bowl of wine, which on some of the sculptures he took, refused, and poured out, sometimes on the ground, on at least one occasion on the sacrificial bull. The authors that I read about this whole connection suggest maybe it was a way of saying, I am the rising God who will be your Lord and God. Others, maybe more simply, I'll give myself for my country. When he had refused the wine, the sacrifice was made. The bull was stunned and then slaughtered, and pieces put on the altar, and the blood, I suppose, poured into the earth. And then the emperor would ascend that massive stairway on the temple of Jupiter, taking his place before the adoring crowd as Lord and God. It was the custom in that ancient culture that one way to show your authority is to have somebody important but just beneath you on the right and on the left. Tiberius stood between someone on his right and left. Claudius had his two son-in-laws. The Flavians, father in the center. The two sons, Domitian and Titus, standing next to him as they stood to honor Caesar, Lord and God. And then, now it's the crowd's turn. And they could acclaim this Savior, this divine Caesar, who will bring us prosperity and success. And again, we don't have record of exactly what they said, but often the acclamation was, "Hail Caesar, Lord and God! Hail Caesar, Lord and God!" And through it all, they kept a sharp eye open for a portent, a sign from the gods. During Julius Caesar's memorial games, a comet appeared in the heavens for several days, which they took to be the sign that he had ascended to the gods. A flock of birds that flew over, something that said the gods put their stamp on what's happening here. And Caesar, by his walk to power, is now Lord and God. You help me with it. I'll give the Roman part. You tell me Marx. They gathered all the Praetorians in the Praetorium.
And the soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is, the Praetorium. And they called together the whole battalion.
And then the Caesar would be given the purple robe, the sign of his sovereignty and maybe even his deity, and the wreath.
They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him.
And then the soldiers, after receiving gifts, had a chance to acclaim, "Hail Caesar, Lord and God! Hail Caesar, Lord and God!"
And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!"
And then a procession, a sacrifice being led, and someone next to it carrying the instrument of death.
Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross.
And they came to a place called Head Hill.
They brought Jesus to Golgotha, which means place of the skull.
They offered Caesar a bowl of wine, which he refused by pouring it out.
Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it.
Then the sacrifice was made, and the bull was killed.
And they crucified him.
Then Caesar ascended the stairs of the temple of Jupiter on Capitoline Hill. Someone on his right and someone on his left.
They crucified two rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left.
And then the crowd packing the forum there in front of the Jupiter temple. "Hail Caesar! Hail Caesar!"
In the same way, the chief priests and teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let this Christ, this King of the Jews, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe.
And then they watched for the signs from the gods.
At noon, darkness came over the entire land until 3 in the afternoon.
The veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom.
The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised.
And God said, "This is my son." That was not a defeat. It was a victory. The greatest power, his authority over every name, every power that exists, came as he humbled himself to be a sacrifice for others. He is Lord.
Yes, he is. Hallelujah.
And the first witness, a Roman Marine.
And when the centurion, who was standing there, saw how Jesus died, he exclaimed, "Surely this man is the Son of God."
And if I had been a first century Roman, I would now delight in explaining to my neighbors that this God, whose kingdom is in this world but not of this world, this God has turned the world's kingdoms upside down, because the way to power, the way to glory, the way to influence is the way of the cross. A willingness to sacrifice oneself for others. Not a defeat, Romans. Not a defeat. A triumph. Will you join the procession? It will cost. You're one of those captives. In the Roman processions, there came a moment when some of those captives were taken out to be killed, as if to say, Caesar has the power of life and death. But you are his captives, who, like the thief, the rebel on the cross, will be set free. But in that procession, you follow the Son of God, who calls us to be like he was, those who offer ourselves to bring shalom to the chaos of others. And the Roman Church became a Christian center. And Caesar, its ruins and restorations. It didn't work his way to power. His did. Thanks be to God, who continually leads us in triumphal procession with Christ. Come.
Question?
That was fun.
Tomorrow night, we're going to talk about study Pentecost. We've never done that during Bible study. It's always been focused in on the events of Holy Week itself. Pastor Jeff, this, as far as I know, this is the first time we have a class just on that topic.
Well, it's difficult to talk about the mission of Jesus without Pentecost. So that's where we're reaching outside of Holy Week